Matthew Henry's Commentary on the Whole Bible. Genesis 39. At this chapter we return to the story of Joseph. We have him here. 1. A servant, a slave in Potiphar's house, verse 1, and yet they're greatly honored and favored. 1. By the providence of God, which made him, in effect, a master, verses 2 to 6. 2. By the grace of God, which made him more than a conqueror over a strong temptation to uncleanness, verses 7 to 12. 2. We have him here a sufferer, falsely accused, verses 13 to 18, imprisoned, verses 19 and 20, and yet his imprisonment made both honorable and comfortable by the tokens of God's special presence with him, verses 21 to 23. And herein Joseph was a type of Christ, who took upon him the form of a servant, and yet then did that which made it evident that God was with him, who was tempted by Satan, but overcame the temptation, who was falsely accused and bound, and yet had all things committed to his hand. The history of Joseph, 1721 BC. 1. And Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither. 2. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master the Egyptian. 3. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. 4. And Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him, and he made him overseer over his house, and all that he had he put into his hand. 5. And it came to pass from the time that he had made him overseer in his house, and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake, and the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house, and in the field. 6. And he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he knew not aught he had, save the bread which he did eat. And Joseph was a goodly person and well favored. Here is, Joseph bought, verse 1, and he that bought him, whatever he gave for him, had a good bargain of him, it was better than the merchandise of silver. The Jews have a proverb, if the world did but know the worth of good men, they would hedge them about with pearls. He was sold to an officer of Pharaoh, with whom he might get acquainted with public persons and public business, and so be fitted for the preferment for which he was designed. Note 1. What God intends men for he will be sure, some way or other, to qualify them for. 2. Providence is to be acknowledged in the disposal even of poor servants, and in their settlements, and therein may perhaps be working towards something great and important. 2. Joseph blessed, wonderfully blessed, even in the house of his servitude. 1. God prospered him, verses 2 and 3. Perhaps the affairs of Potiphar's family had remarkably gone backward before, but, upon Joseph's coming into it, a discernible turn was given to them, and the face and posture of them altered on a sudden. Though, at first, we may suppose that his hand was put to the meanest services, even in those appeared his ingenuity and industry, a particular blessing of heaven attended him, which, as he rose in his employment, became more and more discernible. Note 1. Those that have wisdom and grace have that which cannot be taken away from them, whatever else they are robbed of. Joseph's brethren had stripped him of his coat of many colors, but they could not strip him of his virtue and prudence. 2. Those that can separate us from all our friends, yet cannot deprive us of the gracious presence of our God. When Joseph had none of all his relations with him, he had his God with him, even in the house of the Egyptian. Joseph was separated from his brethren, but not from his God, banished from his father's house, but the Lord was with him, and this comforted him. 3. It is God's presence with us that makes all we do prosperous. Those that would prosper must therefore make God their friend, and those that do prosper must therefore give God the praise. 2. His master preferred him, by degrees made him steward of his household, verse 4. Note 1. Industry and honesty are the surest and safest way both of rising and thriving. Sayest thou a man prudent and faithful and diligent in his business? He shall stand before kings at length, and not always before mean men. 2. It is the wisdom of those that are in any sort of authority to countenance, and employ those with whom it appears that the presence of God is. Psalm 101 verse 6. Potiphar knew what he did when he put all into the hands of Joseph, for he knew it would prosper better there than in his own hand. 3. He that is faithful in a few things stand fair for being made ruler over many things, Matthew 25 verse 21. Christ goes by this rule with his servants. 4. It is a great ease to a master to have those employed under him that are trusty. Potiphar was so well satisfied with Joseph's conduct that he knew not aught he had, save the bread which he did eat. Verse 6. The servant had all the care and trouble of the estate, the master had only the enjoyment of it, an example not to be imitated by any master, unless he could be sure that he had one in all respects like Joseph for a servant. 3. God favored his master for his sake. Verse 5. He blessed the Egyptian's house, though he was an Egyptian, a stranger to the true God, for Joseph's sake, and he himself, like Laban, soon learned it by experience. Chapter 30 verse 27. Note 1. Good men are the blessings of the places where they live, even good servants may be so, though mean and lightly esteemed. 2. The prosperity of the wicked is, one way or other, for the sake of the godly. Here was a wicked family blessed for the sake of one good servant in it. 7. And it came to pass after these things, that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, Lie with me. 8. But he refused, and said unto his master's wife, Behold, my master wotteth not what is with me in the house, and he hath committed all that he hath to my hand. 9. There is none greater in this house than I, neither hath he kept back anything from me, but thee, because thou art his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness, and sin against God? 10. And it came to pass, as she spake to Joseph day by day, that he hearkened not unto her, to lie by her, or to be with her. 11. And it came to pass about this time, that Joseph went into the house to do his business, and there was none of the men of the house there within. 12. And she caught him by his garment, saying, Lie with me, and he left his garment in her hand, and fled, and got him out. Here is 1. A most shameful instance of impudence and immodesty in Joseph's mistress, the shame and scandal of her sex, perfectly lost to all virtue and honor, and not to be mentioned, nor thought of, without the utmost indignation. It was well that she was an Egyptian, for we must have shared in the confusion if such folly had been found in Israel. Observe. 1. Her sin began in the eye. She cast her eyes upon Joseph, verse 7, who was a goodly person, and well favored, verse 6. Note 1. Remarkable beauty, either of men or women, often proves a dangerous snare both to themselves and others, which forbids pride in it and commands constant watchfulness against the temptation that attends it. Favor is deceitful deceiving. 2. We have great need to make a covenant with our eyes, Job 31 verse 1, lest the eye infect the heart. Joseph's mistress had a husband that ought to have been to her for a covering of the eyes from all others, chapter 20 verse 16. 2. She was daring and shameless in the sin. With an impudent face and a harlot's forehead, she said, Lie with me, having already, by her wanton looks and unchaste desires, committed adultery with him in her heart. Note, where the unclean spirit gets possession and dominion in a soul, it is as with the possessed of the devils. Luke 8 verses 27 and 29, the clothes of modesty are thrown off, and the bands and fetters of shame are broken in pieces. When lust has got head, it will stick at nothing, blush at nothing. Decency, and reputation, and conscience, are all sacrificed to that Baal Peor. 3. She was urgent and violent in the temptation. Often she had been denied with the strongest reasons, and yet as often renewed her vile solicitations. She spoke to him day by day, verse 10. Now this was 1. Great wickedness in her, and showed her heart fully set to do evil. 2. A great temptation to Joseph. The hand of Satan, no doubt, was in it, who, when he found he could not overcome him with troubles and the frowns of the world, for in them he still held fast his integrity, assaulted him with soft and charming pleasures, which have ruined more than the former, and have slain their 10,000s. 2. Here is a most illustrious instance of virtue and resolved chastity in Joseph, who, by the grace of God, was enabled to resist and overcome this temptation, and, all things considered, his escape was, for aught I know, as great an instance of the divine power as the deliverance of the 3 children out of the fiery furnace. 1. The temptation he was assaulted with was very strong. Never was a more violent onset made upon the fort of chastity than this recorded here. 1. The sin he was tempted to was uncleanness, which, considering his youth, his beauty, his single state, and his plentiful living at the table of a ruler, was a sin which, one would think, might most easily beset him and betray him. 2. The tempter was his mistress, a person of quality, whom it was his place to obey, and his interest to oblige, whose favor would contribute more than anything to his preferment, and by whose means he might arrive at the highest honors of the court. On the other hand, it was at his utmost peril if he slighted her, and made her his enemy. 3. Opportunity makes a thief, makes an adulterer, and that favored the temptation. The tempter was in the house with him, his business led him to be, without any suspicion, where she was. None of the family were within. Verse 11. There appeared no danger of its being ever discovered, or, if it should be suspected, his mistress would protect him. 4. To all this was added importunity, frequent constant importunity, to such a degree that, at last, she laid violent hands on him. 2. His resistance of the temptation was very brave, and the victory truly honorable. The almighty grace of God enabled him to overcome this assault of the enemy. 1. By strength of reason, and wherever right reason may be heard, religion no doubt will carry the day. He argues from the respect he owed both to God and his master, verses 8 and 9. 1. He would not wrong his master, nor do such an irreparable injury to his honor. He considers and urges how kind his master had been to him, what a confidence he had reposed in him, in how many instances he had befriended him, for which he abhorred the thought of making such an ungrateful return. Note, we are bound in honor, as well as justice and gratitude, not in anything to injure those that have a good opinion of us and place a trust in us, how secretly soever it may be done. See how he argues, verse 9. There is none greater in this house than I, therefore I will not do it. Note, those that are great, instead of being proud of their greatness, should use it as an argument against sin. Is none greater than I? Then I will scorn to do a wicked thing, it is below me to serve a base lust, I will not disparage myself so much. 2. He would not offend his God. This is the chief argument with which he strengthens his aversion to the sin. How can I do this? Not only, how shall I? Or, how dare I? But, how can I? Id possumus, quod jure possumus, we can do that which we can do lawfully. It is good to shut out sin with the strongest bar, even that of an impossibility. He that is born of God cannot sin, 1 John 3 verse 9. 3 arguments Joseph urges upon himself. First, he considers who he was that was tempted. Others may perhaps take their liberty, but I cannot. I that am an Israelite in covenant with God, that profess religion and relation to him, it is next to impossible for me to do so. Secondly, what the sin was to which he was tempted, this great wickedness. Others might look upon it as a small matter, a peccadillo, a trick of youth, but Joseph had another idea of it. In general, when at any time we are tempted to sin, we must consider the great wickedness there is in it. Let sin appear sin, Romans 7 verse 13, call it by its own name, and never go about to lessen it. Particularly let the sin of uncleanness always be looked upon as great wickedness, as an exceedingly sinful sin, that wars against the soul as much as any other. Thirdly, against whom he was tempted to sin against God, not only, how shall I do it, and sin against my master, my mistress, myself, my own body and soul, but against God. Note, gracious souls look upon this as the worst thing in sin, that it is against God, against his nature and his dominion, against his love and his design. Those that love God do for this reason hate sin. 2. By steadfastness of resolution. The grace of God enabled him to overcome the temptation by avoiding the tempter. 1. He hearkened not to her, so much as to be with her, verse 10. Note, those that would be kept from harm must keep themselves out of harm's way. Avoid it, pass not by it. Nay, 2. When she laid hold of him, he left his garment in her hand, verse 12. He would not stay so much as to parley with the temptation, but flew out from it with the utmost abhorrence. He left his garment, as one escaping for his life. Note, it is better to lose a good coat than a good conscience. 13. And it came to pass, when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand, and was fled forth, 14. That she called unto the men of her house, and spake unto them, saying, See, he hath brought in an Hebrew unto us to mock us, he came in unto me to lie with me, and I cried with a loud voice. 15 And it came to pass, when he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled, and got him out. 16 And she laid up his garment by her, until his lord came home. 17 And she spake unto him according to these words, saying, The Hebrew servant, which thou hast brought unto us, came in unto me to mock me. 18 And it came to pass, as I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me, and fled out. Joseph's mistress, having tried in vain to make him a criminal, now endeavors to represent him as one, so to be revenged on him for his virtue. Now was her love turned into the utmost rage and malice, and she pretends she cannot endure the sight of him whom a while ago she could not endure out of her sight. Chaste and holy love will continue, though slighted, but sinful love, like Amnon's to Tamar, is easily changed into sinful hatred. 1. She accused him to his fellow servants, verses 13 to 15, and gave him a bad name among them. Probably they envied him his interest in their master's favor, and his authority in the house, and perhaps found themselves aggrieved sometimes by his fidelity, which prevented their purloining, and therefore they were glad to hear anything that might tend to his disgrace, and, if there was room for it, incense their mistress yet more against him. Observe, when she speaks of her husband, she does not call him her husband, or her lord, but only he, for she had forgotten the covenant of her God, that was between them. Thus the adulteress, Proverbs 7 verse 19, calls her husband the good man. Note, innocence itself cannot secure a man's reputation. Not everyone that keeps a good conscience can keep a good name. 2. She accused him to his master, who had power in his hand to punish him, which his fellow servants had not, verses 17 and 18. Observe, 1. What an improbable story she tells, producing his garment as an evidence that he had offered violence to her, which was a plain indication that she had offered violence to him. Note, those that have broken the bonds of modesty will never be held by the bonds of truth. No marvel that she who had impudence enough to say, Lie with me, had front enough to say, He would have lain with me. Had the lie been told to conceal her own crime, it would have been bad enough, yet, in some degree, excusable, but it was told to be revenged upon his virtue, a most malicious lie. And yet too, she manages it so as to incense her husband against him, reflecting upon him for bringing this Hebrew servant among them, perhaps at first against her mind, because he was a Hebrew. Note, it is no new thing for the best of men to be falsely accused of the worst of crimes by those who themselves are the worst of criminals. As this matter was represented, one would have thought chaste Joseph a very bad man and his wanton mistress a virtuous woman. It is well that there is a day of discovery coming, in which all shall appear in their true characters. This was not the first time that Joseph's coat was made use of as a false witness concerning him. His father had been deceived by it before, now his master. 19 And it came to pass, when his master heard the words of his wife, which she spake unto him, saying, After this manner did thy servant to me, that his wrath was kindled. 20 And Joseph's master took him, and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in the prison. 21 But the Lord was with Joseph, and showed him mercy, and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. 22 And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison, and whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. 23 The keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him, and that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. Here is 1. Joseph wronged by his master. He believed the accusation, and either Joseph durst not make his defense by telling the truth, as it would reflect too much upon his mistress, or his master would not hear it, or would not believe it, and there is no remedy, he is condemned to perpetual imprisonment, verses 19 and 20. God restrained his wrath, else he had put him to death, and that wrath which imprisoned him God made to turn to his praise, in order to which providence so disposed that he should be shut up among the king's prisoners, the state prisoners. Potiphar, it is likely, chose that prison because it was the worst, for there the iron entered into the soul, Psalm 105 verse 18, but God designed to pave the way to his enlargement. He was committed to the king's prison, that he might thence be preferred to the king's person. Note, many an action of false imprisonment will, in the great day, be found to lie against the enemies and persecutors of God's people. Our Lord Jesus, like Joseph here, was bound and numbered with the transgressors. 2. Joseph owned and righted by his God, who is and will be the just and powerful patron of oppressed innocents. Joseph was at a distance from all his friends and relations, had not them with him to comfort him, or to minister to him, or to mediate for him, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy. Verse 21. Note 1. God despises not his prisoners. Psalm 69 verse 33. No gates nor bars can shut out his gracious presence from his people, for he has promised that he will never leave them. 2. Those that have a good conscience in a prison have a good God there. Integrity and uprightness qualify us for the divine favor wherever we are. Joseph is not long a prisoner before he becomes a little ruler even in the prison, which is to be attributed, under God. 1. To the keeper's favor. God gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. Note, God can raise up friends for his people even where they little expect to find them, and can make them to be pitied even of those that carry them captive. Psalm 106 verse 46. 2. To Joseph's fitness for business. The keeper saw that God was with him, and that everything prospered under his hand, and therefore entrusted him with the management of the affairs of the prison. Verses 22 and 23. Note, wisdom and virtue will shine in the narrowest spheres. A good man will do good wherever he is, and will be a blessing even in bonds and banishment, for the Spirit of the Lord is not bound nor banished. Witness St. Paul, Philippians 1 verses 12 and 13.